When we started at MTV, it was the greatest calling card you can have. No one knew what we were really in for. We did MTV News. MTV had all these shows that we were making the graphics for. If you wanted to use a font, Chiron, that was different. You had to physically shoot every letter, how to be flexible, how to go from the Xerox machine to a paint box, to the Harry, the Henry, whatever is next. When I was wearing my MTV badge, everybody was chasing you. So I decided to call it artichoke because it was a very organic word in a very digital time.
Welcome to the season finale of Season 1 of the Promo Cowboys podcast. I know what you're thinking. Already? Actually, I'm one of those guys who likes a short, bingeable season and more seasons to follow, which I intend to make good on in the fall of 2016. Look for Season 2 of the Promo Cowboys podcast sometime around Halloween or the end of the Major League Baseball season, whichever comes first. Meantime, I plan to make good on a promise I made in an earlier edition of Promo Cowboys, which I'll elaborate on at the end of this podcast. Stay with me if you want to hear it. For now, though, let me revel in the completion of my maiden voyage as a podcaster and the safe return of my passengers to port with this very special edition and this very special guest.
T-minus 27 seconds.
You know, you can't throw a brick in New York without hitting someone who says they were part of the MTV launch. You can't throw a brick in New York without hitting a TV designer either.
T-minus 15.
My guest today is both, and I did not throw any bricks at her, though I think she might like to throw one at me.
9, 8, 7.
Nancy Paladino came reluctantly, haltingly, to the Promo Cowboys podcast. It might have been the ongoing trouble we had with Skype, or that Nancy Paladino, like the great characters of classic literature, demurs when first challenged, only to be later drawn in when the stakes are raised. Just listen to her story of first being asked to come to MTV.
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
Back then, I didn't know what MTV was. No one knew what it was. A friend of mine said, I'm working at a place and they're looking for a graphics person. Why don't you come up and have lunch? And I said, oh, it's Midtown, corporate. Oh, I don't know. Oh, just come and have lunch. Went up there. Everybody was young and energized.
What year was this?
1981. It was 2 weeks before the August 1st launch. And I interviewed with Sue Steinberg, and she was the EP at the time. And after our discussion, I immediately went home and made some graphics and brought them back to her. And I think that impressed her, so she hired me.
So you didn't know going in really what you were going in for, but by the end of that interview, you were like, I want this gig.
Oh, yeah, of course. And they didn't have much time, so they stick me in a little room, and we started putting graphics together. No one knew what we were really in for exactly.
We know times have changed because no one really talks about MTV anymore. At least not in New York's TV promo and marketing circles. Not like they used to. There was a time, though, not long ago, when MTV was revered as the pinnacle of promotion. They were the masters of marketing. The dudes who did design cooler than anyone. And I, and many of my colleagues, consistently looked to MTV to influence the work we did for, well, lesser networks.
We didn't even have a Chiron. We were going to set the type at that time. So they all learned very quickly. I mean, most of the time it was collage. We had no stock photo digitally. We were right down the street from the picture library. They had a stock photo library, so we'd send an intern to look up, and then we'd sort of montage a little story together for all the over-the-shoulder graphics. I mean, you were in news, you know what
Sure.
The over-the-shoulder, but we, luckily being in music, can be funky and fun. And I did this all by myself until I finally got help.
Okay, but previous to the launch, during this 2-week period, you're doing a lot of artwork. Did you have a whole lot of exposure to the rest of the network at the time? And were you sensing that, you were literally about to fire the first shot in a revolution?
We worked 14 hours a day, didn't realize we were in the revolution. But we were in Midtown corporate offices, and then the studio was on was this tiny little studio on 33rd Street and 10th Avenue.
So, okay, so you guys are gearing up to launch the network. You know, when you're about to flip the switch, where were you at the time? Were you guys gathered? Was there
We had to go to New Jersey to watch the launch, the actual launch, because it wasn't in New York. And as I said, up until that point, we were working night and day and not sure if it was all going to come off. And it was a small group. I mean, it was, I don't know, maybe 30 people at this time, which really wasn't a lot. So yeah, we ran over to New Jersey. We saw it launch, and now we were just getting all kinds of coverage. I think we had this funny story in the New York Times because we were a group all under 30.
Yeah.
Now everybody's under 30.
Oh, I am a jolly Irishman from Ireland I came. Do you want to know more about me? Pat Murphy is my name.
It sounds like you're saying that you guys weren't sure that anybody was really watching. Maybe not the first year, the first several months, but clearly you guys sort of developed into a zeitgeist kind of quickly.
It was the greatest calling card you can have. It was sort of like going to Yale if you were a lawyer or something, I suppose. You know,
okay.
It basically helped to launch your career. You can sort of walk into any door, or being MTV, everybody wanted to work there. Everybody wanted to come. Now it seems like everybody did work there.
Oh, yeah.
Who doesn't have it on their resume? But I'm glad I stayed 5 years and not 20. Go to sleep, little baby. When you wake, you shall have all the pretty little horses. On your other podcasts, which were all great, by the way, I just really enjoyed them all.
Thanks.
Enormously, in fact.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, a little plug. But honestly, for writers and such, I mean, you have a writer, your typewriter might change and the computer changes, but for graphics, my God, talk about a revolution, what we went through. I don't know if people remember the paint box, but you needed a room for it. You needed a separate room for the computer. And when we started at MTV on Chiron, you had to shoot. If you wanted to use a font that was different, you had to physically shoot every letter and manually put it in to the computer. People made a living doing that. Peter Caesar made a great living doing all the the Chiron. So every time you wanted to change a font, can you imagine what that would be like? And we had to, ramp up and stay with the technology. And that's one of the things I did learn at MTV was how to be flexible, how to go from the Xerox machine to a paint box to, the Harry, the Henry, and whatever is next.
So you didn't go from the Stone Age to the present day, but you went from the Bronze Age to the present day.
Oh boy, felt like Stone Age if you think about it.
Rawhide fiddle and a cough so full of gun over there for Cotton Eye Joe.
When did the paint box actually come into your workflow?
83 or 84. I think 84. And there was only about 5 in New York. Broadway Video had the first one, I think. And then we might have had the second, and Peter Caesar had one, and you had to book it, and but we had our own. So I just stayed, all night long until I learned how to do it. And then by that time I had a staff, and then we sort of worked it around the clock. We did the MTV News, and then we did, MTV had all these shows that we were making the graphics for, and stuff for the promo department.
And when you left, you had climbed to art director at MTV, but you were part of a certain department.
We were production. My art direction fell into production, on-air production.
On-air production, okay, which is a big job.
Production is the engine that just kept going. We were the ones who put with the VJs and the wraparounds and the contests and the concerts and all the special shows and the New Year's Eve show. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I left, because I felt like if you're an in-house department, you have to keep doing the daily grind, and then all the special stuff goes out of house. And that's one of the reasons why I thought, oh, if I leave, I can actually spend time making something.
Did you guys have a sense, though, that after, I don't know, 6 months or a year or 2 years, we're leading the TV industry at this point?
Yeah, I mean, you think about 1982 and 3. Once it was in New York, MTV was cover of magazines. It was the hot item. It was the big thing being talked about. but it was cable, you know. So cable in itself was all new. CNN launched at the same time. So everything was kind of opening up.
And I've worked on a number of cable launches, since I came to New York, which is a few years after MTV launched. And I mean, some launches went, spectacularly well, and some were really kind of just a sort of a fizzle, a slow burn, if that. But would you rate the launch at MTV?
It was a slow burn. That's what I'm saying. The first year we were not even on in New York the first entire year, and that was somewhat by design because you didn't want to show your worst stuff.
What about the logo? Because you guys were able to have so much fun with the logo and really mess with it and pull at the edges and break it down. And
Fred Seibert worked with Manhattan Design. His thinking was the M was supposed to model after Superman a little bit. That's where the big chunk came from. The TV drove me crazy, I have to say. Of course, it's supposed to feel like graffiti. But the best part was to always screw around with it and make it as much fun as you can, which we did.
You go to a network now and their logo is, there's a logo police force to make sure that you don't do those things. And it's a rare opportunity that you get to actually have fun with a network logo the way you guys did.
Yeah, I mean, I like to believe that good design will lead the way where you need it, you want it, and you'll continue with it. And hopefully it supports what you do and, in fact, enhances but doesn't overpower the storytelling. And that's what I would like it to always be a good partner in.
Well, the great thing about MTV is it was overpowering design, but it was what everybody wanted. I mean, it was a drug. It was like candy. It was like heroin.
Right. I was just going to call it. It was visual eye candy, but with music behind it. I mean, it definitely changed. You'll never look at music the same way again. I mean, that was one of the tags, but it was a long time ago.
Ride on, mighty rider, you got your reins in your hand. Well, I ride on, mighty rider, you got your reins.
Talk about the culture. What was it like there in those early years? I imagine it to be something like everybody's working and they're having a party at the same time. Now, I know that's probably not the case.
No, I think that was the case. That was the case. I mean, it was a lot of work. You worked really hard and you played really hard. And like I said, we'd be flying to different post houses, and it was a very exciting time. And you talk about the culture. Look at the New Year's Eve show, how that took off. Mm-hmm. Really, that launched into. And then I remember when they did the awards with the spaceman as the award. That was another Manhattan Design concept, making the little spaceman. One of the producers' son was 3 or 4 years old and saw on network news the astronaut putting the United States flag on the moon, and he turns around and says, "Hey, Daddy, that's not right. It's supposed to be the MTV. It's supposed to be your flag." So kids were thinking that MTV landed on the moon.
More of my conversation with Nancy Paladino in a moment. But first, this Promo Cowboys podcast is brought to you by bourbon, beer, and bar pretzels, and by the TV crime novel Promo Cowboy by Barry Fitzsimmons. That is me. Look for Promo Cowboy at Amazon, Kindle, and your finer bookstores. So you are enough of a promo cowboy, Nancy, that you left MTV in 1986 when it was just catching fire.
It was hot. People thought I was crazy. When you're the in-house team, you have to keep everything going, and you don't get to really focus on a project. You go out of house and people get the real plum projects. So I said, well, I think I need to go out of house. And the truth was, it did serve me in that respect because I did become one of their vendors. And actually, I ended up being more of a vendor to, say, Nickelodeon at the time, and then over to Showtime. And so it was really nice. So it was kind of a brazen move to make because MTV was so hot at the time. Oh, and Sumner Redstone had just taken over, and I thought, oh, I don't want to be part of this big corporate.
You didn't want to work for the man.
I didn't. Like, we lost that real fun flavor we had, you know, that casualness that we had. So host houses were getting on their own personality, and VideoWorks, they said, you know, you'll get your own paint box, which we did, and a Harry and a Henry and all that good stuff. I told you I didn't even want to work in Midtown. I was such a brat, and you know, and that's why I'm my own boss for the last 20-something years.
That's guts. That's guts.
With my doggies at my feet, always.
Okay, so you go to VideoWorks, and they give you your own paint box.
Right. So we started. Then I once again had to start up a department and put a team together, and that I stayed there for 5 years. It's funny, that was my limit, 5 years. So I had MTV for 5 years, and then VideoWorks for 5 years, and much of that clientele was MTV Networks, and Showtime, and all those people. Mm-hmm. So the cable stations.
HBO? Anything for HBO?
Not so much HBO, because HBO had their own studio and a lot of paint boxes on 23rd Street. So it tended to be more Showtime. And A&E, we did a lot for A&E, and all of this spin-offs, the Biography Channel and all that. So it was all that cable network world, which was very creative, fast-paced. You're just thinking on the fly. And the thing also with the paint boxes, you'd be working on it, you're creating on it, people would be sitting behind you. That's how you worked. It was kind of crazy, you know?
Well, yeah, I was the guy.
You were probably many of the time saying, I want that to look like this, and yeah.
And I have my feet up on the console, and I'm likely eating something and reading something.
Oh,
you know,
VideoWorks used to. We had an in-house chef, because you know, the clients would come in, and I have to admit, if I should say this, I didn't really care. Talk about madmen. I did think ad agency were madmen. I did not want to work with agency people. I did work mostly with broadcast, because it was a much more, I thought, creative. I mean, agency people, it took 20 people to decide what color blue was.
There's no trust involved in the
crazy.
Agency.
Yeah.
I think the trust that's built between a producer and an editor, or a producer and a designer, is really, it's unfortunate it's been sort of lost.
But we made stuff. That was the fun thing. We made stuff that you know.
It's funny how the fewer hands that go into something like that, you actually get a more interesting product. Obviously, the more people involved in the decision making, the more like everything ends up being blue.
Such a slam against my talent made me hotter than a mink, and I swore that I would write it for amusement or for kink. It was nothing.
So you were key, though, to when you made this move and you sort of settled in there, to incorporating design into the post-house business model, which maybe to that point it wasn't necessarily as much part of the front office stuff.
The technology dictated it. So, you know, Paintbox led the way, but Quantel was making all these other things, you know, the Harry and the Henry. And for those who don't know what that is, it's basically what's now After Effects, but in a machine that cost, you know, $200,000, $300,000, $400 for the Henry or something, $400,000. So people booked it by the hour. Of course, now that's all in a laptop that, you know, you can carry around. But all the post houses had divisions with graphics departments in them. It was funny because you talk about going to Promax. When I was wearing my MTV badge, everybody was, you know, chasing you. When I suddenly became the VideoWorks creative director, I lost my trail of.
Did you have to do a little sales?
Oh, no, well, not really. And that's another point. Is there was salespeople, but the truth was they came. I just always had a nice little following. I mean, you know, nothing earth-shattering, but people who like to work together. And even in my own business, I never needed sales. It was word of mouth and people that you continue working with. And I think that's really important because salespeople don't always know exactly what you do or what you do best, so they don't always bring in the project. Whereas I like the client to come to me because they know what I do. I mean, there was a few years there I was doing everything sort of by hand. I worked with Curious Pictures, and I'd morph them. My design method was sort of like drawing, and everything turned into something else. And I became sort of the queen of doing that for like Curious Pictures, and there had some advertising people, and Showtime I did it for, and that was
what
fun.
year are we talking about when you're developing this and sort of mastering it?
Like 1990, 92, 93. I was doing a lot of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I was working at Comedy Channel then.
Oh,
They
yeah.
had just launched, so maybe I saw some of your work.
Yeah.
Because we took license with our logo. We took license with what we stood for as a brand. It was a very short period before, we actually merged with Ha and then ultimately became Comedy Central. But
merged with I ate up Ha.
We ate Ha. I thought they ate us. I was the first person laid off from the combined Provo Park, which is a story that I tell in one of the other episodes. So you left VideoWorks after 5 years or so? Is that when you formed Artichoke?
Yeah, and that wasn't really a plan necessarily. All I thought was, maybe it's time for me just to go freelance. It was not a plan to have my own business. And I just kept pretty busy, and I didn't have my own space. I was working out of my apartment. I hired my sister, did some of my bookkeeping from my apartment.
But you were able to do your design work in your apartment.
Well, then that, I was starting to work on Photoshop, Illustrator, and then I would go into the facilities and rent the boxes. And because, like I said, I would be the client.
You were such a pioneer. We're talking early 90s, right?
92.
Yeah.
I did that. Yeah.
Wow.
A few of us, sort of did that. Patrick McDonough.
Sure.
BXB. Patty Bellucci did it.
Phil
Del Borgo.
Big Fat TV, sure.
Right.
He was doing a lot of stuff for Comedy Central. or Comedy Channel then. And Ada Whitney left Broadway.
Ada Whitney, right. So that we were like that cluster that sort of, I guess you can call us pioneers, whatever.
Miss Paladino said he hovered at the third floor window.
Initially, I called it Paladino Design, which was woof. I just thought it was weighty, but I needed to have my own name because people knew me. And then I eventually liked artichokes, so I decided to call it Artichoke because it's a cluster and it's got a heart in the center, and it was a very organic word in a very digital time.
Okay, no shit. I have the most admiration for the name of your company because I grew up on artichokes, being a California kid.
Yeah.
We eat them different out there than we do here on the East Coast, but it starts with an A, which totally makes sense.
Right.
And it does sort of say a whole lot without saying more than a single word. So it is a perfect name.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you chose Artichoke down the road then. You sort of reincorporated, or you...
It's about 2 years into it. I just felt like I didn't want it to be on only my show. I wanted to feel like we were a studio, a group. And I wanted a more abstract name rather than just being Paladino.
It's cool.
I was glad I did it, yeah.
Paladino's not bad, but Artichoke is great. I mean, Paladino sounds almost like it's got to be a man.
Well, it does mean brave. Paladin. Remember Paladin? Yeah. It's Latin for brave or knight.
And there's a great TV show.
Have gun will travel.
Paladin, Paladin, where do you roam?
One more thing about the name Nancy Paladino chose for her design firm. An obvious point, and I'm pretty good at making them. You can't say artichoke without saying art. Boom.
Have gun will travel, reach the card of a man.
One of the things that is a super tragedy to me is the way the Post House business model has kind of crumbled. And you were part of what made the Post House business model kind of grow into something really wonderful. But tell me what your take is on what's happened to the Broadway videos and the Unitels and the national videos.
It's technology. It's the technology. The fact that you can put everything on a laptop, a whole edit system, a whole graphics studio. Technology just completely led the way, and I don't want to say destroyed it, but I remember when Showtime was doing that whole Predator thing, and okay, you can be a producer and an editor, and they were training all their producers to edit their spots on their laptops, and all of that is great, and some people have the talent, but what people forget is not the same person isn't going to have the ability, the talent to write it, produce it, edit it. I mean, there are some, but it was sort of nice when people had their roles, whether it's the designer, the storyteller, the whatever, and the editor, and everybody brought something to the party. And it was really, I think, richer. I think some of it has definitely suffered from being in one box, which being in one box means it sometimes comes from one head or one hand.
Or so many that there's no actual central idea anymore. It's just, what does it say on the marketing brief? That's kind of one of my beefs as we go through the season on Promo Cowboys here, is that I love a marketing brief because it sort of lets you know what you're there to create.
Yeah.
But it should never
dictate. It shouldn't be the tight framework. It shouldn't put you in a box. Yeah. It should just give you the framework.
Well, usually it says think out of the box. Every single marketing brief I've ever seen.
And then if you do, they bring you back in.
Oh, the liars will be running in that great day. Lord, the liars will be running in that great day. Lord, the liars.
You are a native New Yorker who has remained a New Yorker. Have you ever lived anywhere else?
Except for my country house, no.
Which is also in New York.
In New York State. It's upstate, yeah. I'm a native New Yorker. I'm a Brooklyn girl. I always wanted to be an artist. I always, was the art school artist and all that kind of jazz. Through high school, through whatever. And, I did painting classes at museums, and then I went to Parsons. And I really wanted to go to RISD, but I didn't want to leave the city.
You studied design at Parsons, but were you planning a career in television design?
No, television was not even on my radar. My major was illustration because for my parents. I didn't want to make them pay for me to get a BFA in fine art. So I thought it was a good compromise. Illustration, I loved, So
and one of my earlier guests, Billy Kidd, is a Parsons graduate also. I don't know if you heard that episode.
I did hear it. Yeah. I ended up teaching at Parsons. It was pretty cool.
Sam Bass was born in Indiana. It was his native home. At the early age of 16, young Sam began to roam. He first came.
The funny thing is going to become an illustrator, which was. You work at home. It's sort of like being a writer. You sit home alone and you make the drawings and then you bring them in. And then I suddenly realized, God, that's not my personality. I really like collaborating with people. I like working with people. And so it was purely by accident that that I should fall into the whole television thing.
I love the siren for what it's worth.
We are in New York. I took a job while I was at Parsons going door to door to art departments, to art directors. I thought it was a great way for me to get to know different art directors. And so I did. I went to magazines and book publishers and ad agencies and, big ones like Siegel and Gale and Ray. And I got to know people there to see what I wanted to do. And once in a while I'd freelance and do a little project for them. And then the MTV thing, popped up. And one of my closest friends at Parsons, a few years later, as I got the job at MTV, he got the job at New York Magazine, which was all the envy. So we both rode that wave together, me and MTV, him at New York Magazine. And we both sort of decided to come freelance around the same time. And we ended up sharing a studio together, print and television studio. He had his company, Don Morris Design, and I had mine.
I was going to ask you his name, Don Morris.
Don Morris Design, yeah.
Is he still in business now?
Yes, sure. He's a designer. I eventually moved out of the studio, so I needed more space because of edit rooms and stuff, and he took over the studio, so it was nice. It was a great time.
It sounds really romantic. You know, the early 1980s, the whole world in front of you, design just changing by the day and growing and becoming, you know, the real driving factor.
Horses in the country eating collard green, whaling in the city eating cold ice cream.
Cable was about, think of broadcast, and we had 3 television stations basically to watch, and then came cable, and suddenly we had 50 stations, but it was about narrowcasting, and now we have beyond a number that you can even describe of what is good and what the content is and what is to watch.
Yeah.
So it's not just narrowcasting now, it's like super focused casting, you know, like people.
That's what this podcast is.
Yeah. And it's, I think it's great. I think there's a lot of wonderful things. Now it's really, really, really spread out. But as always, you know, the cream comes to the top, and hopefully the good work is what survives. I have to say, I don't watch network television. I haven't in a long time. I watch PBS, and then I watch selective television.
Speaking of PBS, I'm a pretty big fan of Ken Burns and all his terrific documentaries. Civil War, jazz, the Roosevelts, baseball is a particular favorite. So when Nancy Paladino and I traveled to Yellowstone National Park with a relatively small film crew that would actually seem large by today's standards, we crossed paths with a Ken Burns film crew. Both crews were at Yellowstone in the middle of January, working on documentaries for the national parks. Ours was for the National Park Foundation. Okay, so we do this great project together for the National Parks Foundation. It was a fundraising video, but we had the opportunity to go to a bunch of parks, including Yellowstone, in the middle of winter.
January.
Yeah, it was, and we were literally at Old Faithful when there was 3 feet of snow packed on the ground, and there were bison. And one of the last interviews that we did when we were at Yellowstone was with Dayton Duncan. Do you remember that?
Yes, who's been in the National Parks Ken Burns series. Sure, I saw him. Yeah.
He's one of his chief producers. And I recall it being at the last minute after dinner, and maybe we've had a drink or two, and they're like, "Hey, we just booked an interview with this guy, and we're going to do it right now." And I'm like, and I'm supposed to be the interlocutor, so
in the hotel room.
Yeah, in the hotel room.
I remember, yeah.
Broke my heart that we didn't ultimately use that material for reasons that I never quite understood. But
we didn't. I thought we got him in there on a couple of
He was in the cut, but we were asked to remove it, as I recall. And I think it was a political decision from a certain administration that was in power then. But he cried. I made him cry.
Yes.
I made him weep.
He spoke of his family, and I do remember that.
That's to me, it's like if you can make an interview subject weep, and not because you're hitting them over the head with a blunt object. You remember that project the same way? Are you wistful over that?
Oh, absolutely. It was a very special and it's funny because it came to me in an odd way. You know, at first I was just going to be doing the design for it, and then he says, "Do you guys want to go out there?" You know, but I loved that storytelling. Don't forget, we went to Washington and going up to Rockefeller's office. I remember seeing all the art up there, which was really great.
Yes, I had to move a Signac and I think a Surratt. We're talking about a visit to David Rockefeller's office atop 30 Rockefeller Plaza. He was then vice chairman of the National Park Foundation and a gracious participant in our video, as was Jim Maddy, president of the foundation, and Gail Norton, the Secretary of the Interior and a member of the Bush cabinet. Yes, that Bush cabinet. But David Rockefeller's office at 30 Rock was a veritable museum gallery with Rothkos and Renoirs, Matisses, Manets, and Monets, etc., etc. I'm literally handling a Seurat.
Right.
We're like taking it off the wall, and I'm like, why are we doing this again?
Yeah.
I'm like holding this piece of art that's probably worth,
Right.
I don't know, $20 million.
Kudos again to you. It was a really interesting project, and the material is great, and it took 10 burns 10 years later to get it. You and I worked together when Artichoke was doing production. One of the reasons we were doing production was because people were designing with live action. So if you remember all those beautiful, elaborate campaigns that were done for like A&E and Showtime and all beautiful, and we would shoot them, like we did 4 for HBO. And then that became out of vogue, and that's when I decided I don't need to do production anymore. Because I wasn't designing with it anymore.
Hard times got everybody in trouble. Not only got you, it's got me, oh Lord. It's got the rich, it's got the poor, it's got the high and low.
You were a board member at BDA for a while. Talk to me about what your experience has been like with the Broadcast Designers Association.
Well, I have to say, I often would suggest to people is, if you want to get out there, get on boards, belong to groups, organizations. It's really important. And I will say that's helped me launch my independent career, because you're meeting people all across the country. It was hard being on the board, though. I have to, I started a campaign because at that time, everybody was asking you to do work for nothing, work on spec. And they would, gather, the hot groups, and they'd say, oh, you're going to redesign this channel or that channel.
If you get the gig.
If you get the gig. So you'd have to put this brilliant package together. And so we all tried to unite, and the designers, music people get their rights, and they get protected. And I think writers are kind of in the same ballpark as we are. So we started this campaign trying to get the clients to understand it's to your benefit as well. You're just going to kill off people. I mean, Kinnard and Sullivan kind of killed themselves by doing so many bids that, they did not think of the bottom line. And so the clients are just basically sucking people dry.
There was an old miller who lived by the mill. Every time the mill turned to its will, a hand upon the hopper and the other on the sack. Oh, every time the mill turned right.
For the 20-some-odd years, I went to every BDA Pro Max and was part of the board, as you said. I thought it was a great time. It's very important to exchange your ideas. I'm not a big fan of awards because I think they're not always fair. I've been a judge many times. But I do think it's great to be part of the organization, and I always suggest young people to join in and be a part of it and have a voice. And like I said, try and better our industry where you can.
You might think someone with Nancy Paladino's design pedigree might never have been asked to leave her place of work. You'd be wrong. She's gotten fired in America.
A friend of mine was working at this toy packaging company, and it's right on 26th Street. And I was working at Parsons. I was going to Parsons. So I would walk over there and cover for her at the front desk for an hour or something like that. It was just, pocket change. And one day, I don't know what I did, but the guy came out. I answered the phone and I told him who it was or something. And this is sort of a scene out of Mad Men. And he came out shuffling his nose.
Oh, okay.
All of a sudden, he was really irate. And I said,
Was he eating a powdered donut by chance?
He was breathing in a powdered donut. And whatever it was, he kind of launched at me, whatever I said. But he definitely said, that's it, you're out of here. And I was a little stunned, and I was fine with it. I said, okay. A couple of days later, when my friend said to me, oh, you realize he was high or whatever.
A scene from HBO's Vinyl.
Yes, exactly. He was totally irrational. I didn't know why, but I was happy. It was not an important job, so it didn't mean a whole lot to me. I was like, that guy's such a jerk.
Oh, Black Betty, bam-ba-lam. Oh, Black Betty, bam-ba-lam.
Any final thought to share?
To all the promo folks out there listening, promos are great, and designers are not always, I don't want to say respected, but not always given as much opportunity as maybe they should. So bring in your designers sooner rather than later. They very often have something to contribute, and you may be very pleasantly surprised.
It should be the way you work with an editor, and back in the day, because you don't really do that anymore, where you're sitting in the same room for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, shooting this shit, and your minds come together in some ways. I mean, I think about the great relationships I've had with great editors in town, and we just lost Joe Tavano recently, and he's somebody that, you know, the two of us would surprise each other.
Yeah, a reminder to all the promo producers out there.
Designers deserve love and respect too.
Yeah, that's right. Appreciate your designers.
Even though they're so much cooler than you, doesn't mean they don't.
Oh.
Well, anyway, okay. God bless you for doing this with me. This has been great. Thank you.
Oh.
And isn't it amazing we did it?
The technology cooperated.
All right.
Take care. Cheers. Ciao.
This edition of the Promo Cowboys podcast has been brought to you by bourbon, beer, and bar pretzels, and by the novel Promo Cowboy, a TV industry thriller by yours truly, Barry Fitzsimmons, available in hard copy at Amazon.com and your finer bookstores, and find the ebook at the Amazon Kindle store. I'd like to thank my guest today, Nancy Paladino, for her time and her thoughts. I also want to thank freesound.org and the Pond 5 Public Domain Project, who provided the instrumental music for this Promo Cowboys podcast. Speaking of music, we heard the theme song to the Western drama Have Gun Will Travel, which debuted on CBS television in 1957. We also heard a band called Sugar Plastic and their song Ohio from their debut disc Bang, the Earth is Round from 1996. Thanks for joining me. This is Barry Fitzsimmons, aka Promo Cowboy. I'm really excited about the people outside the industry who may have found this podcast interesting, and certainly the people inside. I hope you'll feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Promo Cowboy, also on Facebook and LinkedIn at Barry Fitzsimmons. If you've got a good story about getting fired, I'd love to use it for Season 2. I hope I'll hear from you. We're, of course, happy to keep your name out of it. It's fun to share. Thanks to my son, Patrick Fitzsimmons, for creating the Promo Cowboys podcast artwork. I want to shout out to my support team, Jared Monero, Charles Berlepsch, Zach Trinka. You guys are the best. Thanks for everything this season. Hey, before we close, about that promise, be on the lookout for a message from your humble host in the days and weeks that come about the audiobook edition of my novel, Promo Cowboy, brought to you chapter by chapter, serial style, beginning soon. Promo Cowboys is a Steve production. Steve is a division of Igloo Media, LLC. This podcast was produced by yours truly, Barry Fitzsimmons. Thanks again for joining us. As Promo Cowboy says, shoot, that mean I don't gotta talk like this no more? I sure miss that fella Greg Trimble. Take us out.